This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khanam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have a great show today, but before we begin, we want to wish our viewers and listeners Ramadan Mubarak to the billions of Muslims all over the world who are celebrating the holy month of Ramadan. Tragically and unfortunately, Palestinians in Gaza are being starved to death during this Ramadan in accordance with the American-Israeli policy to starve them into submission. We're going to be talking about the current events in Palestine, especially in Gaza today, Jamal, especially the fact that the so-called ceasefire has technically ended, but there are negotiations going on. And despite Donald Trump's threat that all hell will break loose if the hostages are not released, the hostages are not released, and Gaza continues to be starved. We're also going to review a new Gallup poll that shows that support for Israel is shrinking rather dramatically, especially among Democrats, and support for a Palestinian state is the highest level it's been since this poll has started. It's at 55%. We're also going to talk about some recent investigations looking at how the United States is whitewashing Israeli soldiers' crimes against humanity in their participation of the genocide. And finally, Jamal, and this is a big story, we're going to be talking specifically about what's happening at your alma mater, Columbia University, who has vilified and actually pretty much expelled a number of students who have been opposed to genocide. They also invited Naftali Bennett, a right-wing extremist. And more interestingly, within the last 48 hours, Jamal, the Trump administration has decided to hold up $400 million to Columbia University because it hasn't been as strong in combating anti-Semitism. This kind of attack on our academic institutions is going nationwide. We'll be covering all those stories today, Jamal.
That's right, Jess. We'll start with the first story, Jess. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are on the brink, and they fear a return to severe starvation they experienced during the course of Israel's 15-month-long genocidal war after the far-right Israeli governments decided to block the entry of goods and fuel starting on March 2nd, and as the Muslim holy month of Ramadan began. The Israeli decision came after the first phase of a ceasefire deal that lasted 42 days ended and in response to Hamas's rejection of a U.S. proposal to extend the agreement's first phase, which doesn't make sense because they worked for weeks and months on coming up with the ceasefire and structured it in such a way that the second phase basically, would include a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
Right.
That's the whole idea of going through the first phase, releasing all the hostages that they have released, and Hamas has fulfilled its obligation. But as usual, and as we've seen what happened in Lebanon, Israel doesn't want to leave. Same thing happened in Lebanon. They were supposed to leave, and then, now Israel wants to keep some posts there. And they want to do the same thing after they agreed. And this is what Hamas, otherwise the hostages that we've seen in different groups of them were released, this would not have happened. And
Absolutely.
now, after they received their hostages, and they're saying, no, we don't want to go to the second phase. The whole concept is basically saying we don't want to withdraw, and then Hamas is saying, well, let's stick with the agreement. This is what we agreed on in Qatar, and Trump now is saying, and he made those threats not once, many times. You gotta release all the hostages today or all hell will break loose. You don't know what's going to happen. We're going to give Israel all the weapons it needs and so forth. And, I don't know. Maybe the threats, Donald, which they did work with Ukraine. After all, Ukraine receives billions and billions of dollars from the United States and in both financial and military aid. But Hamas receives nothing. So I don't know what they have to lose. I mean, what
They
more
have nothing to
destruction?
lose.
What more
No.
destruction they're going to inflict on them than they've had already?
Well, I think that's exactly right, Jamal. Hamas has nothing to lose. They have the upper hand. They haven't been defeated. They haven't been wiped out, either politically, economically, or militarily. They continue to function. And despite the threats from Donald Trump, they're not backing down. Now, another interesting part to this story, Jamal, and we know that Israel does not want a ceasefire. Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't want a ceasefire. His right wing extremist cabinet doesn't want a ceasefire. While we're focused on Gaza, we know that the West Bank, including Nablus, is under attack as we speak. Maybe we'll have some time to speak about that. But an interesting story did come out in the last day, Jamal, and that's the fact that the United States has been having their own one on one negotiations with Hamas. So the United States is, quote, negotiating with a terrorist organization, close quote. The United States has always had this policy. Trump has had this policy, never to negotiate. They've sent opening invitations to Iran this week. Now they're speaking directly with Hamas. It's kind of interesting to see what's happening in the larger context. But the reality on the ground, Jamal, is Palestinians in Gaza are starving to death during Ramadan. And it's pretty clear that the Israeli intention has nothing to do with ceasefire. It has nothing to do with getting the hostages out. It has nothing to do with peace. So this is a very tense situation.
Well, it's worth mentioning that Israel tried to derail these talks between the United States
Right.
and Hamas in Qatar, and is spying or tried to spy on
Right.
on these talks, according to some media outlets
Right.
that reported on this issue. But really, I mean, if you've made a deal, why not stick with it? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It's basically, which we know, we could speak for an hour or two on Benjamin Netanyahu's intentions. He has no intention to leave. Basically, he wants to occupy Gaza. They want to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. And you mentioned the West Bank, which is, we'll talk about it, actually, it's very important. But also now you have the holy month of Ramadan, and you're starving an entire population. You're let's say you have this issue with Hamas, but this is collective punishment. You're punishing 2 million people who have been through hell in the past few months, and you're committing additional war crimes on top of the war crimes that have been committed. And now in the West Bank, they're implementing the same thing in Jenin, Tulkarem, and other areas. And this is publicly declared. This is the plan for Smotrich, for Benjamin Netanyahu, for his entire government. They're going full force against Palestinians. They want to, basically make them kneel in front of, this is what they said. They said if they want to live here, they have to kind of basically accept everything that Israel want to impose on them. They're not giving them any rights, and they want to maintain the occupation. And now there is a big rally to convince Donald Trump to allow Israel to annex the West Bank. And this is something
Right.
Our audience should not be surprised if we start talking about it in a few weeks or maybe even less, because this is the way I see things heading unless something different happens.
Well, Jamal, I think technically, maybe legally, quote, Israel has not annexed the West Bank, but functionally, the West Bank has been annexed and under total Israeli control forever. So what we're seeing in the Trump White House, and this is really important, the push on Trump to get the United States to support the annexation of the West Bank is not coming from AIPAC, is not coming from right-wing extremist Israeli groups. It's coming from Christian Zionists. The Christian Zionists, the the groups that really kind of have fomented and kind of created this kind of Zionist kind of fantasy land for the Trump administration and the United States foreign policy are the ones that are pushing Trump to support the annexation of the West Bank. It's really not just disturbing, but kind of portends what we're kind of in front of in terms of the foreign policy. I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think there's every indication, while everybody's concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, that Israel is continuing a campaign of ethnic cleansing and destruction in the West Bank. And for all intents and purposes, they may decide to legally take the steps to formally annex the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But I mean, you and I know this, Jamal, functionally in terms of the day-to-day life of Palestinians, whether it's area A, B, or C, it's essentially functionally annexed right now. Palestinians in the West Bank are unable to move freely. They're basically stuck in their respective villages and communities right now. Jenin, Tulkarm, parts of Nablus are being uprooted literally as we speak. So the situation for Palestinians right now is pretty grave.
That's right. And, talking about the international community response to this, worth mentioning that everyone is opposed to this except the United States. I mean, the United States hasn't admitted, but actually the European Union and European countries are against it, against the annexation, and also against the collective punishment, stopping the food and the trucks from entering into Gaza. So there is a little bit of a split now as far as, within those countries that supported the war.
But does it mean much, really?
Gaza.
Does it really mean much?
It just shows there is a change of attitude. But I have to say also the United Nations, and they try to convene now also to discuss things, about the situation in the West Bank and the Palestinian states in Geneva, to avoid basically New York and the pressure that happens in the United States. And the Swiss government refused to allow this from happening.
Right. The Swiss government, the neutral Swiss government, refused to let it happen.
I mean, the whole idea is to have like kind of a secondary location for the United Nations to kind of be away from New York, is to allow things from happening. But the Swiss government actually refused to allow any meeting to discuss basically what's going on in Palestine and the ethnic cleansing in Gaza and the attacks in the West Bank.
One quick last point, just as irony of ironies, Jamal. So the Trump administration is negotiating and speaking with Hamas, but they're not speaking with Abu Mazen, and they're not speaking directly with the Palestinian Authority. And we should also mention that the Arab League got together this last week and put forth their own plan for Gaza, which has nothing to do with the American plan. It actually, in looking at the plan, it's very similar to the plan that you had suggested well before the Arab League meeting. But of course, it's not getting any traction in the Western media and the Western press, and the United States is completely rejected it. They're still talking about the Riviera in Gaza and forcibly removing 2 million Palestinians. So the political dynamics right now are very, very disturbing in terms of what we can anticipate in the future.
Well, the plan actually is supported by the EU. As if you mentioned, the United States refuses to even acknowledge that plan. And just to remind our viewers and listeners, the plan basically entails that a reconstruction of Gaza happens. I think they put a budget or an estimate of $47 billion. Of course, this figure,
it's low.
It's probably low for.
It's very low.
And Egypt would manage, and other countries, Arab countries, would manage that. The population in Gaza would stay where they are, right, whether in temporary housing or tents or RVs or something like this, while they're going through the reconstruction. And so that kind of like, throws a monkey's wrench in Donald Trump's plan of basically transferring the Palestinians from Gaza into Egypt, because they rejected that, and into Jordan, and it makes a lot of sense. And by the way, the plan does not mention any money coming from the United States or
Right.
from Europe. This money basically comes from wealthy Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE. Why would you refuse something like this? When basically the Israel, with the support of the United States, with the support of the UK, with the support of France and Germany and others, have destroyed the infrastructure of Gaza, and basically they're responsible for it because they weren't going after Hamas. They were
Right.
killing civilians. I mean, they were bombing hospitals, they were bombing schools, and basically now they're not going to be footing the bill for it.
Well, yeah, they're not going to foot the bill. I mean, the United States isn't going to foot the bill for its own domestic policies. I mean, you know, we're not speaking about it today, Jamal, but Donald Trump and Elon Musk have decided to cut tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of positions and jobs. People are being laid off in the United States at all levels of the government, of the VA. They're going to cut Medicaid. They're going to stop funding on dramatic programs to support underserved communities here in the United States. Why would the United States, in any way, shape, or form, commit to supporting Palestinians in Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, or anywhere? And of course, the Israelis don't want this plan either. So probably what's going to happen, what I'm concerned about, Jamal, is that we'll get into a holding pattern where nothing will happen. Israel will continue to starve Palestinians in Gaza. They will remain in Gaza, but they will be on this death diet, this starvation diet for all the men, women, and children, and that the situation will just continue to deteriorate because there's a lack of will on the part of the United States and certainly among the Israelis, among Netanyahu specifically, to make any changes. So, do you really think Netanyahu and his government are going to allow Egypt and the other Gulf countries to come into Gaza and reconstruct it? I don't think that's on the table, Jamal. What do you think?
Well, I don't think Netanyahu has any say into this if the United States pushes him to do so. I mean, we know who's in control, right? We know what happened with Ukraine now. You know, you could have like Zelensky come to the White House and wave his hands and talk so valiantly, and then feel the heat afterwards, and now he's backtracking when, if the United States decides to do the same thing to Israel, which it should, stop military aid and financial aid, trust me, things will change so quickly on the ground, as Trump would say, it will happen so quickly, whatever, and it will change. I mean, yes, you can have Benjamin Netanyahu when he comes here and you roll the red carpet for him, and he just stumps his way through Washington, D.C., into the White House and Congress, and everybody is applauding him. Yeah, he's going to do whatever he wants to do. He still receives that full support, both financially and morally. And I think the American public sick and tired of this. I mean, this is we're now people are complaining about the price of eggs in this country, and we're still sending billions of dollars to Israel for basically achieving nothing. They haven't released except 4 hostages with force. The rest happened through negotiations, and that they had to release them. And they just want to basically continue this wasteful war, kill more Palestinian children, destroy any remaining infrastructure in Gaza. But we know that the people in Gaza, and they declared their intentions many times. They're not moving 1 inch out of their country. Basically, you can move them within their country. Egypt is not planning to open its borders to allow them in. Jordan certainly is not going to allow them in. They have their own issues. And that's the issue is does the United States and does the American taxpayer want to continue footing the bill for Israel's mayhem and destruction.
Yeah, I think this is going to be the main point that needs to be driven home to Americans, and it will get to our second point here in a second, because what is like painfully obvious to Americans who, as you said, have seen a dramatic increase, not just in the price of eggs, Jamal, but in the price of everything. Trump's economic policies and his whiplash on the tariff issue with Canada and Mexico, with China, and now all these other countries is causing economic panic on Wall Street. Financially, things are very unsteady right now. They're going to cut Medicaid and Medicare, Jamal. They're going to cut the cuts that they want to make are drastic to mostly poor people and marginalized communities. And how are Americans going to feel when prices keep going up and services keep getting cut, yet they see that steady stream of billions and billions and billions of dollars, US dollars, going to Israel? I think that's the main point that we need Americans to understand. And, that point is not lost on a lot of people. In fact, this Gallup poll, Jamal, is I think a dramatic reflection of the changing attitudes in the United States, finally.
Yeah, and we're talking about the new Gallup poll, which is actually unprecedented because it shows now that Israel receives less than half of those who polled have sympathy towards Israelis, and support for establishment of an independent Palestinian state remains at majority level. Majorities of Democrats, independents, support independent Palestinian state. And given their majority level sympathy for the Palestinians, it follows that the Democrats are also broadly supportive of an independent Palestinian state. And, the figure just is about 3/4 of Democrats. 76% are in favor of such a state, compared with 53% of independents, while 40% of Republicans.
That's pretty high for Republicans.
A Palestinian state. That number basically has doubled.
Yeah. That's a big deal, man. That's a huge deal. Well,
I mean, while support for Palestinian state by Democrats has been trending upward since 2021, actually. And the also support amongst independents has been relatively steady over the same period. Republicans' support is up 15 points.
Wow.
This year. So that's a sharp actually increase in 1 year. And but if I recommend, it's a long and very extensive poll to go through the different numbers during our show. So if people just Google basically the Gallup poll, Israel, right, Palestine, it will show up first, and you could read all the details. But the bottom line, American sympathies with the Israelis continue to decline, because they've been on a decline actually for many months now, and largely because of Democrats' dwindling support for the Israelis in the long-standing conflict with Palestinians. And meanwhile, the establishment of an independent Palestinian state is still supported by a majority of Americans, though by far more Democrats than Republicans. So I think this is a very important poll, and it shows a decline for basically it's just kind of like a balanced scale. There's a decline for Israel supports and a rise in sympathy towards Palestinians. And then if you look at outside the Democrats and the Republicans, you start looking at, I think, the most important group, which is the young group, the youth, ages between 24 and 35.
Yeah.
The numbers even go much higher. I mean, obviously, we've seen that on college campuses. That's why,
Right.
people are still demonstrating on college campuses, but it's like it just shoots way up. I mean, you have a whole new generation, and that's going to be in public service, who are going to be the new doctors, lawyers, congresswomen, congressmen, and people in government. And that is actually the biggest fear that APAC actually had distributed a memo just a few weeks ago, just warning about that. That's actually the main topic for APAC now, discussing how to counter that.
Well, I think what's really interesting to me, Jamal, is the billions of dollars spent by AIPAC and the extremist right-wing Israeli groups, pro-Israel groups in the United States. And we're talking billions of dollars to promote Israeli interests, to promote the Israeli ideal, to market the Hasbara, the American Israeli Hasbara, to whitewash and pinkwash and greenwash and wash Israel, to give it a patina of this beacon of democracy, has been an utter failure, Jamal. All those billions of dollars has completely failed. I mean, what we're seeing is that dollar for dollar spent, AIPAC and its surrogates and its Hasbara, supporters, they're losing, and they're losing rather dramatically. And I think the age breakdown is very dramatic, and I think it's very telling. I mean, they're losing, and they're losing big, and they have nothing left in their in their kind of arsenal of like how to promote Israel. Israel has been deemed an apartheid state. It's, by all international groups, is committing genocide. The International Court of Justice and the ICC have their ongoing investigations around genocide. The UN. I mean, it's kind of globally condemnation of Israel, its policies, and its government. So my question to you is like, well, what's AIPAC going to do? How are you going to whitewash, pinkwash, greenwash, wash, this criminal enterprise called Israel? How are you going to make it any different? It's only getting worse. So I don't know about this memo, Jamal. I mean, what are they going to do? How are they going to rectify this? I mean, it's kind of bizarre that they think they can turn this around. I mean, maybe they have something up their sleeve. What do you think?
Well, sadly, this poll does not reflect the U.S. government, and I'm talking about Congress. I mean,
Right.
still they, got them, by the throat, basically, all these people who have been receiving money for years from AIPAC and all these surrogates. The numbers haven't changed that much. Yeah, there are few people who kind of like refused to receive money from AIPAC or became a target became a target because of speaking out against Israeli atrocities and so forth. But we still have a big, wide gap between those who support Palestine and those who basically oppose a genocide and so forth. And so for the time being, AIPAC is going to continue to invest in politicians. But their fear is, what's going to happen in 10 years? What's going to happen in
Right.
20 years? They're not worried about now. And sadly, this is very sad because, if Israel decides to nuke Gaza, I don't think many people in Congress would complain. Or they'll find a pretext and excuses. They'll make, excuses for why they had to do it, just like we're making excuses in the United States about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and saying, we wanted to end the war and whatever. So killing hundreds or millions of people is no big deal to them. They have them all in their pockets. We see that happening now. Otherwise, Israel would not continue to receive the money and receive the billions of dollars. And that includes the administration. I mean, that
Right.
includes, when Trump came to power and said he wants to negotiate a deal, and negotiate. I mean, a ceasefire. Well, the ceasefire happened. Yeah, bravo, you did that. You forced a ceasefire, but now you're saying, why don't you give away all the hostages? And we're still, if you don't do anything, we're gonna basically destroy Gaza, or we're gonna make it into a Riviera. We want to transfer the population, and people are saying, yeah, within Congress, I mean, for any sane person, they'd say, what is he talking about, the Riviera in Gaza? I mean, well, I have news to you. The Riviera in France is not doing that well. The economy in Europe, not too many people have the money to go to the Riviera, even in Europe. Yes, I mean,
Well, that's really, lost on a lot of people. And I just want to say one other quick thing, Jamal, because I feel like we have to say this before we kind of go to our next segment. But what the Gallup results also show is how catastrophically the Democrats failed this country in the last election.
well, that's why they lost.
Right. By supporting a genocide, by supporting a genocidal government of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu, of refusing to condemn the genocide and the mass murder and slaughter of tens of thousands of Palestinian men, women, and children in Gaza. The Democrats failed this country. They failed the global community. Their moral bankruptcy is costing the entire world community so much economic, political instability now. And they are still trying to whitewash it, Jamal. They're still trying to say, oh, the reason we really lost was because of these economic issues, where poll after poll after poll has shown that the people who didn't vote for Joe Biden, or who didn't vote for Kamala Harris and the Democrats, didn't vote for them because of their stance on supporting genocide and supporting Israel. When are this is, I'm saying this question ironically to you, but when are the Democrats going to look at the Gallup poll, going to face reality? When are they going to look in the mirror and say, we failed? Supporting Israel is a failed strategy. I don't think they're ever going to do it. You still have Hakeem Jeffries, licking the boots of Benjamin Netanyahu and Apex. So, this is on you, Democrats. You failed, and it looks like you're going to fail again.
I think you can take this even further. I think the Democrats don't realize how many young people they have lost.
Exactly.
And I can tell you, most of these people are independent.
Yeah.
They come from families and houses that historically been Democrats and registered. Right. They might be registered Democrats just because it's a tradition, but they are not Democrats at heart. They don't follow what Hakeem Jeffrey and Nancy Pelosi and others tell them to do. It's a whole different ball game. In fact, they resent them. I mean, it's no longer with the young people, like whether I'm going to be a Democrat or a Republican. And like I said, they might have been Democrats or their parents are Democrats. But actually, in general, if you speak to people who voted against the genocide, who refused to vote for Kamala Harris and voted for a third-party candidate, or even didn't vote at all, you know why? If you ask them the question, why didn't they do that aside from the genocide, they will tell you that they despise the Democrats' leadership. This is how far you can take it, because they are the ones, before Trump came into office, they were the ones who were getting attacked under Biden. The Biden administration was given the green light to basically, beat them up and drag them out of college campuses and conspiring with the administration against them and so forth. And now, of course, which we'll talk about it later on, the Trump administration is adding further things to basically get rid of foreign students and so forth. But I think the Democratic Party is in deep trouble. It's in shambles. It's in disarray. And, I mean, we're talking now, the Trump administration, Trump has been in power for less than 2 months. But elections are around the corner. Those 3 years will fly so quickly, and they just don't know what they're going to offer. If they're going to come with the same agenda, about same story about foreign policy and supporting Israel and supporting despots around the world, they're not going to win.
No, they're not going to win, and they'll continue this self-destructive pattern to undermine democracy. And this is going to relate to, our last segment. You are absolutely right. The Democrats, the Biden administration, Kamala Harris, were intimately involved in undermining the pro-democracy, anti-genocide protests on college campuses, rather than supporting free speech, rather than supporting our democratic process of, opposition and confronting a moral kind of blight on this country by supporting genocide. They refused to do it. They locked him up. They didn't do anything to support this. And not only that, we know this, Jamal. We talked about it ad nauseum. Biden-Harris gave billions of dollars. Biden stood up there in his demented state and says, I'm a Zionist. So, the Democrats can blame Arabs all they want for their woes, but they're just scapegoating, and they're not looking inward and doing the careful self-reflection and kind of accountability that they need to do to take accountability and take responsibility for their failed policies. And they're losing, as you said, Jamal, they're losing so many young people, 18 to 35, don't want to have anything to do with the Democrats. Nothing. And if they think they're going to win, they're delusional.
And you know who has not learned their lesson in basically saying the truth or reporting the truth, aside from the Democratic Party support or blind support to Israel, is U.S. media. And this is our next topic. I want to touch on this quickly. You'll think, like, after what happened, I mean, of course, now they're trying to be more careful about reporting what's going on and reporting the
No, they're not.
people who have been killed, but
No.
they are still saying the same old lies, about the babies and beheaded babies and the rape stories and whatever. You'll still find this, even though that those stories have been debunked. And when they're not saying them, they just have this subtle way, basically, of giving Israeli officials significant advantage in shaping agendas and the language of the reporting. People have to pay attention to this, whether it is the New York Times or CNN, and of course the worst one of them all is the Wall Street Journal. And I can go down the list, but this has not changed a bit.
No, I think it's gotten worse, Jamal.
Even when they're challenged, I mean, we can give examples. I was looking at a story recently, I think in the New York Times, but don't quote me on this, but one of the main publications. And they're talking about the recently released soldier, last name Alexander, and he's talking about when he was in captivity, that he was mistreated and starved by Hamas and so forth. They're trying to give, because we've seen the images. Well, those are the ones you cannot deny, because even CNN showed the images of the Palestinian prisoners, basically all, skeletons, basically walking around, showing signs of torture, whatever. So they're trying to counter this. And here's, I'm going to give you an example on how they describe the language. It will blow your mind, Jess. So they're talking about this Israeli soldier. Of course, they call him hostage Alexander. I forgot his name. And the language goes on, said, kidnapped while wearing an IDF uniform. I mean, look at the gymnastics in the language, because they don't want to describe him as a soldier, which, by the way, he was a soldier in the Golani brigades. Even the Israeli media identifies him as such, and this is the the Proud of Israel, the Golani Brigades, which, by the way, has been destroying Gaza day in, day out. And he was dragged out of a tank. And to go through this gymnastics of words to say, number one, kidnapped, not
Prisoner of war.
prisoner of war, is a soldier, while wearing an IDF uniform.
He happened to be wearing an IDF uniform.
Yeah, what is that? He's
a soldier.
Exactly. So I just had to mention this because I thought, oh my God, after months of, like as if people don't know that a lot of these so-called hostages are soldiers. Yes, there were, civilians, but even the civilians, most of the civilians have served in the Israeli military one way or the other. And then to just describe this one guy who basically was in full uniform, was on duty, and he was taken as prisoner. He surrendered, taken as prisoner of war, to say kidnapped while wearing an IDF uniform. How crazy is this?
Yeah, I mean, it's just bizarre, Jamal. It's journalistic malpractice, I think. It's malpractice on the parts of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, all of these so-called journalists who continue to whitewash and continue to ignore the stark reality of what happens and what continues to happen. I mean, it's kind of insulting. I mean, why isn't the media in the United States talking about the hundreds of Palestinian journalists that were murdered in this war? Why are they not talking about the death of all the media and the denial of Israel to allow independent media to cover what's really happening in Gaza and the West Bank? They expelled Al Jazeera and no one's talking about it. So, I think, the complicity, we talked about it with the Congress. It's obviously with the mainstream media. But they too will pay a price, Jamal. They too will pay a price because looking back at the Gallup poll, looking at the kind of generational difference, the 18 to 35-year-olds don't read the New York Times for news. They don't read the Washington Post. They don't watch CNN. They don't watch any of the mainstream media. They get their news from social media, which, we have to be clear about it, is actually in many ways more accurate when it comes to like reporting from Gaza and from Palestine. So, they're cutting their own throats, Jamal, economically. So they want to be destructive like the Democrats. Bring it on.
Well, that's why I said that they haven't learned their lesson.
No.
Basically,
no.
Just to show their, they wear the bias on their sleeves and continue.
They're proud of the bias, Jamal. They're proud of the bias.
Yeah,
they're proud. They really are. They're being fair and balanced. By saying happen to be wearing an IDF uniform. Happen to be wearing. Well, guess who wears IDF uniforms?
What is it? Halloween? I mean, it's ridiculous. I want to move on to our final story, Jess, and basically I want to ask you a question. How many reports have you heard of cancellation of lectures by prominent professors or visiting guests to talk about the situation in Palestine or Gaza, whether at Harvard University or other universities?
Well, I could tell you just this morning, well, the answer is hundreds. And just this morning, I received an email canceling a lecture that I was supposed to give, a medical lecture to a prominent medical school on the East Coast that I shall not name, just writing me this morning that my lecture on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, scheduled for this Thursday, Jamal, was canceled. Oh my God. And I'm not special because hundreds of people who have been scheduled to give talks at universities, at medical centers throughout the United States, have had their talks canceled. So, what's happening at Columbia, for example, and what's happening, nationally, if not globally, it's kind of out of control right now. There's been a real catastrophic collapse of academic freedom in this country?
I'm glad you mentioned academic freedom, because in the midst of all of this, with cracking down on anyone who wants to speak about Palestine or teach about Palestine, Columbia University allowed former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett to come to campus and give a speech. I mean, this is, they're cracking down on their students, and I have to say it is noteworthy that Bennett did not just boast about killing Palestinians and Arabs. I mean, you can Google that, and he said that on many occasions. But he previously pledged to do everything in his power to displace Palestinians from the Gaza Strip as well as from the West Bank. I mean, here is someone who boasted about killing Arabs and who is promoting the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And in 2018, when he was education minister, and 3 years before becoming prime minister, he said that he would order the army to shoot and kill Palestinian children who breached the border fence with Gaza, saying, and I'm quoting here, "They are not children, they are terrorists." So he considered all Palestinian children are terrorists. And so now they've canceled, there's a whole list, like they've canceled your lecture, they've canceled so many other prominent Palestinian professors and others who are not Palestinians, from, I said, Harvard University all the way to the West Coast here on college campuses. But they allow Bennett to go there, and then they are very concerned and asking the question, why are hundreds of students were gathered on campus to demonstrate against him?
Yeah, and here's the thing, Jamal, which is so hypocritical about Columbia among all the campuses. They allowed Naftali Bennett to speak freely, but then cracked down and tried to shut out the protesters. Oh, why are people protesting Naftali Bennett? They allow him, they give him a free opportunity to spew this hateful rhetoric. And you may not like what I'm going to say, but I'm fine with Naftali Bennett coming to Columbia and speaking hatefully about, Palestinians. I say, let him speak. Let the world see how hateful and racist these individuals are, but allow them to have protests. Don't deny Palestinian voices. Don't deny Palestinian narratives. Don't deny Palestinians the opportunity to speak. So it's not the fact that they invited Naftali Bennett, which is, whatever. It's an academic institution. They can do that, but allow other voices. Let there be protests. Why not? You can protest Joe Biden. You can protest Donald Trump at Columbia if you want, Jamal, but you can't protest Naftali Bennett. That's just, and here's what I know we don't have time to talk about it, but the Trump administration is upping the ante. They denied Columbia University, your alma mater, $400 million because they're not fighting anti-Semitism enough. And they're going to do that to universities across the United States now. They're holding money, and they're going to crack down more on Palestinian voices, on Palestinian students, on Palestinian faculty and their allies. We're going to see a dramatic crackdown coming from the Trump administration, Jamal. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, the biggest threat now is they're targeting foreign students. And
yes.
That's
one of whom has been,
they just passed a law, like if you demonstrate, if you wear a keffiyeh, if you speak against Israel, and then again, that's the conflation between, anti-Semitism and the criticism of Israel, you will lose your student visa and you will get deported. I mean, that's basically, just take, people come to the United States from all over the world because they believe in freedom of speech, and this is where you can feel free, go to college campuses and so forth. But now, what I have to say is also this is going to create financial hardships to universities. You talk about Columbia University. I don't know if it's going to be affected by the U.S. government money,
it will.
because
it will.
Maybe a little bit. I mean, the Ivy League schools, they have so much money and endowments to last them for many, many years. But they also, correct me if I'm wrong, the foreign students pay full tuition.
For the most part, yeah.
For the most part, foreign students pay full tuition.
And then some.
They don't get financial aid and whatever. So that's also another big income. They come to this country, they pay full tuition, they pay for their housing and so forth. Not everyone just comes and walks into an Ivy League school from overseas without either an international full scholarship, like I know from people from the Gulf. Their government pays for that.
Right.
And others, they just come from affluent families and pay full tuition. So now what's going to happen is you're not going to have another source of income for these universities. You're going to lose the diversity. I mean, that whole idea is you go to college campus and you meet people from all over the world. But now people are going to be worried about coming to this country because if you say the wrong thing, you're out of there.
Well, yeah, and some students have been deported, Jamal. And here's the other part of the story, which we should, we'll cover later on. A number of pro-Israel groups are using AI to scour social media to look for all people who've protested, Israel's genocide. And they're using it to identify these students and send them to the university officials, asking that they be in accordance with this new Trump law, this new Trump executive order, to deport these students and strip them of their visas. So the pro-Israel groups are actively engaged now with using artificial intelligence to identify these students and trying to get them removed from the United States. It's a very, very disturbing development, Jamal. We will be paying attention to this story as time goes on.
I think this begs the question whether the First Amendment should be reevaluated.
What First Amendment?
Well, I'm saying we have it on the in the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean,
there is a First Amendment. If you're going to tell me all these exceptions to the First Amendment, I want to know. I don't want to wait for the government, for Donald Trump,
Jamal,
or Marco Rubio, or whatever, telling me.
You know the exception. You know the exception.
Well, let's define it. Then
I'll tell you. It's the Palestine exception.
Well, then I want it to be rewritten.
Yeah.
To be amended. If the language that is in the First Amendment is not respected as is, and is subject to debate, then it should be amended. Maybe they should put that. There is a First Amendment, but you cannot criticize A, B, C, D, whatever.
It's just A, Jamal. It's just A.
Well, I want to know. I want it in writing, because if we want it in writing, not open to somebody on college campus or someone complaining, whether it's a student or somebody in the administration. The university administration says that, you insulted a certain group, you did that, it's all now open to interpretation, and this is really sickening.
Well, I don't think it's open to interpretation anymore. I think it's very clear coming from the Trump administration, and the universities have done this, Jamal. They're shutting down Palestinian narratives, history, speech, Palestinian speakers, solidarity activists. They're cracking down. They're not hiding this anymore, Jamal. The Trump administration has said, this is what we want. We're going to hold up your money unless you do otherwise. Columbia is a test case. They're going to do it on the West Coast with all the UC schools. We're already seeing it. I think, and we don't have time to talk about it today, but next week, Jamal, Trump's going to announce another travel ban, a Muslim travel ban again. So, to me, the First Amendment does not. There's the Palestine exception. There always has been. Should it be amended? I think it already is amended. Maybe not officially, but I think it is.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.